And good morning. Once again, you should have 3 handouts. I am going to be asking you to do some talking to each other, so if you're not right next to somebody else, you'll probably end up needing to move next to somebody else. I like to do interactive sessions, so if you come in, grab the 3 handouts, find a seat near somebody else. I'm an English professor, and I should tell you that because I'm going to be talking about welding and liberal education, and it's not usually what you would expect an English professor to do, but I just need to let you know from the start that I truly am that. And I'm going to talk with you this morning about liberal learning for returning adults. Now, by liberal learning, I mean the kind of education that opens, enriches, and liberates the mind so that the person can go on learning through life. Now, that is an old-fashioned definition of liberal education. It doesn't mean political liberalism, and it really is old. Here is John Adams on the subject of liberal education. So let's look at the 18th century. Laws for the liberal education of the youth, especially of the lower class of the people, are so extremely wise and useful that to a humane and generous mind, no expense for this purpose would be thought extravagant. So the concept of a mind-liberating education has been with us in the United States for a long time, and that is what I am talking about. I'm going to suggest that we use liberal education in a new way, liberal learning in a new way, to open up possibilities for people who aren't usually expected to have the opportunity. For our purposes today, it's for adults when they return to college in Georgia, specifically. And I mean to include diverse and low-income adults and developmental learners who go to college later in life. These are the people you are thinking about. And I know that Georgia intends to approve attainment rates, especially among young adults between the ages of 25 and 34. That group in Georgia, you probably know this, has fallen behind even in the state, so that young adults have an attainment rate of 36%, which is lower than the Georgia population of adults as a whole, which I found was 37.4, and well below the national rate of 40.9%. I am with you in the concern about young adults and their future in Georgia. My office at the Association of American Colleges and Universities is dedicated to the work of liberal learning in broad access and open access institutions, both 2 and 4 years. And I've been learning a great deal from our member institutions in my work with them over the past 6 years. The best collective thinking about a mind-liberating education for all students, and I'm trying to take that understanding from our 1,330 college and university members at AAC and U. So I want to share with you some of our collective ideas and apply that learning specifically to your work in Georgia with returning adults. And I'm really, really glad to have a chance to have that conversation with you. And I see more people coming in. Do please get the 3 handouts if you come in. Okay, welders. Welders. I love them. I'm learning so much as I think about welders. I'm going to use welders as my example. We're going to talk about them a lot. I particularly like this picture. These are welders of the future. And actually, that future turns out is right now. They're young adults who've just won a prize for high-tech welding. And actually, on the right is the first teenage woman to win this particular welding prize for shipbuilding. So I want you to think about these young adults, these young people. She was a teenager when she won that prize, and their liberal education and the somewhat older adults who are returning to college in hopes of getting into their world. This is a complicated picture. The workplace is changing dramatically as we work to bring adults back to college. John Adams would say, spare no expense to do that. We need to give it our best. Now, just to see if I can find out a little more about you, do you know AAC&U, the Association of American Colleges and Universities? Would you put your hands up if you know AAC&U? Okay, so many of you do. We're about to become a century old, AAC&U is. We were founded as the Association of American Colleges in 1915. We were an association just for liberal arts colleges. And for a century, we've been asking one question. Here it is. What should students learn in college? Now, I want you to think about that question and hold it in your mind. It wasn't the only question we asked, but it's been our guiding question. We're a nonprofit, non-lobbying higher ed association that institutions can join, and many institutions in Georgia are members. We became AAC&U in 1995 as our population of member colleges and universities diversified to include community colleges, technical colleges, and universities. And it was a good time, that was a good time to ask, what should college be in the 21st century? And we spent years asking that question of hundreds of people on and off campuses across the country and studying what people said. I got involved in those discussions when I was at Temple University in Philadelphia. And an amazing thing happened. We started to find consensus about what a 21st century education should be, what a 21st century liberal education should be. We called it LEAP, Liberal Education and America's Promise. You may have heard of LEAP. Have you heard of LEAP? Some of you I know what it is. Okay, so it's our centennial initiative. And what I'm going to do today is use LEAP materials, which I've given you, as I make suggestions for liberal learning for returning adults in Georgia. Now, I'd like to begin with just a moment of reflection and exchange. I'd like you to start by thinking about your own experience as a learner. What empowered you as a learner? What was a really powerful learning experience that you had at some point in your life that really made a difference to your learning? We're going to look at the characteristics of that kind of learning. I'd like you to turn and talk to somebody else for just a couple of minutes and share ideas about some powerful learning experience that you had. Something that happened to you. And then I'm going to call people back together and we're going to gather some ideas about it and we're going to go on from there. So, reflect, talk to your neighbor about a powerful learning experience that really made a difference to you. Okay, let's come back together. This is a very fun exercise. You can do this, by the way, with 1,500 people. I've done it. You really can. It's really fun to do. I recommend it to you. I got the idea from a provost I used to work with. He used to do it with parents who came in for one of those admissions events. At any rate, I would love to have you shout out characteristics of powerful learning, or tell a little story. Who heard something really interesting and cool? Somebody want to just stand up and say, or shout out a characteristic, a descriptor of something that you heard about powerful learning? You were definitely talking to each other. I know we got some stories there. Somebody brave. JT is standing up. Okay.
Anxiety and responsibility. Actually, the responsibility of knowing what it is that you are learning and then being able to regurgitate that, if you will, and then the anxiety of having to do that.
There's a really strong emotional component of it that really got into something that was deeply important to you. I know I'm interpreting there, but that's a motivator. You want to own the learning. You want to eat it. You want it to be you, and you're anxious because it's so important. So highly, deeply engaged, even almost to the point of feeling strange or sick, I guess. And some people say that learning is a little uncomfortable. Anybody else want to throw in an idea? Yes. Yeah. culture of hands-on experiential learning across the board on campus for everybody, where everybody's an educator and everybody gets involved in learning. I love it. Hands-on, applied, experiential. We always hear this. Anything else you want to add? Yes?
Learning that makes you feel smart to accomplish
Something
something.
that,
Examples of what we want to learn.
yes, learning that made you believe in yourself and your own intelligence so you could develop a positive mindset, sort of the way Carol Dweck says about mindset. So you believe in yourself as a learner, and everybody can do that. Really, really important. Anybody else want to add something? Yes?
Ours was more, I guess, words, but we focused in on learning that brings about relevance through connections and ultimately results in utilization of something.
Yes. Connections within a group or a community where you can apply and use the work and make something happen. Really, really that really has to happen to engage people. And I agree. Active, hands-on, relational, emotional, and often through connections to a caring person who could be a mentor, could be a teacher, could be a partner, could be somebody in the community. These are the characteristics of learning that motivated you. They are exactly what you want. I know I'm preaching to the choir. Exactly what you want for returning adults. Because education is not the filling of a pail. It's the lighting of a fire. And I told you I'm an English professor, so I gotta have some Yeats there. I'm going to suggest a proficiency-directed framework for learning and assessment designed to meet a set of engaged liberal learning outcomes, including the characteristics you've just identified as the basis for work with returning adults. That's my whole story. That's exactly how do we move into a proficiency-based, outcomes-directed framework for liberal learning that does just what you've said for returning adults. So let's begin with 3 broad goals. I think you're going to agree that with all 3 of them. First, we've got some workforce goals, knowledge and skills that you need for success. And we know we want these for returning adults. And this is an interesting picture. Can you see it very well? What's it look like? A harvester. And if you're really a good reader of technology, there's something weird about that harvester. Can you see a little white rectangle on the top of the harvester? On top of both of them? Guess what that is? GPS. That's right. These are robots. Yeah, there are no people in this harvester. The workforce is changing, and obviously for returning adults, we want to prepare people for a fast-paced economy that's changing over time. That's one of the goals, and that's a liberal education goal. We're going to see that. But here's another one, and this one mattered to you. You were talking about purpose as learners. Purpose, preparation to make a life of meaning and purpose. I was interviewing a guy with a PhD who had grown up in a migrant camp, California, and I asked him what got him into philosophy, got a PhD in philosophy, had spent his childhood doing migrant work, and he said to me, Susan, when you grow up harvesting onions, when you spend your life in an onion field, you're likely to say to yourself, what is the purpose of my life? Okay? That was the most powerful endorsement of a liberal education. Purpose really matters. It's not just the narrow training to get them in the door for a job. It's purpose. Really important. And that is going to relate to what I'm saying about proficiencies in liberal education. And then finally, citizenship. How am I responsible beyond myself? And in the examples that you gave of engaged learning, you actually were talking a bit about that. How am I responsible beyond myself, in my community, as a learner? And our pluralistic democracy really depends on this kind of engagement. Call it civic engagement, not just on workforce development or individual profit. So my challenge to you as you're thinking about liberal education for returning adults is this. Ask yourself this question: are we emphasizing the first, the workforce readiness, and not accounting sufficiently for the second and the third when we're building our programs? And what might we do if that's not the case? Now, maybe you've got it all. I would love to know it, because I sure want to see it. But let's start with the very best thinking that we can get about an education that gets you ready for the workforce, that invites you to think about your purpose, and that gets you involved responsibly in your community. This is what we think we found in consensus about liberal education. I want you to keep those welders in mind as we do this section here. I want to walk through. These are the essential learning outcomes. I told you a few minutes ago that when we started LEAP, Liberal Education and America's Promise, we went all over the country talking to people about what 21st century college learning should be. This list of outcomes was the result. It was an astonishing consensus. It was the first framework from LEAP. It's called the Essential Learning Outcomes, and they are noticeably active, just the sort of thing you asked for. You focus your knowledge, you practice your skills, you anchor your personal and social responsibility in the community, you integrate and apply your learning. Everybody all over the country was saying, this is what a college education should be. So, think about returning adults needing all of those broad proficiencies. Some of them they have already achieved. And I'm going to make the case that we can define proficiencies and assess their achievement of these outcomes in a way that addresses the needs adults have for meaningful work, purposeful life, and civic engagement. And I want to show you some ways that you might do that. So at this point, I would like you, please, to take your Introduction to LEAP pamphlet and turn to page 4. It's on the screen, but you can see it in the handout. These are the essential learning outcomes, and they're broken out into their subcomponents. Also, the whole thing is a set of outcomes. Now, I want you to think about what's important about these outcomes as you're looking at them. What might be missing? Is there something in particular that you think is important for people coming back? What's especially significant to you and your program? I have had this conversation with people all over the country in the last 6 years, and sometimes I hear people say, we want sustainability to be added. It's not in there. Would like to have it. And one group said, you need to take creativity and make it its own bullet. Don't attach it to critical thinking. That's really important. And another group, I was talking to the academic senate of the California community colleges a couple of months ago, and they said quantitative reasoning really ought to include financial literacy, and you need to put that right up front if you really want to address learning for low-income people, especially coming back to college. So you might think of some other ideas of things that are missing. And I don't know, anybody have something that popped into your head that you want to shout out? You are welcome to do it. Yes, yeah, a couple of you. Collaboration. Yeah, you say integrative and applied learning, but it doesn't say that word. I love it. And next to it. Systemic. Yes, that's a good one. I've heard that one before. Missing. So maybe we need to do a better job of that. Good catch. Anybody else? Collaboration and systemic thinking. Really wonderful examples. Okay, so I was at Wallace State. Oh, there's another hand. It sure is. And you know what? I'm going to come back to that because I think it's so important. Reflection. If you're annotating it, put that one down too. Yes, I promise. Come back to that. So I was at Wallace State Community College in Alabama, and I don't know whether you've ever been to Wallace State. I was there a couple of months ago, and had this conversation about the essential learning outcomes. And the welding chair, this is how I got onto welding. The welding chair put up his hand and he said, all right, I'm running our welding program. And we had CTE chairs and we had arts and sciences chairs. And I look at these goals and I say, I need them to know about diversity. I need them to know about ethics. I need that. And he was very animated and unhappy because he wasn't sure what to do with it. He said it with real force and passion. Why did he say that? I was dumbfounded. What the heck? Why did he say that? I need this. I need diversity. I need ethics. Anybody want to guess why the welding chair cared so much about that? Was that something you'd expect the chair of a welding program to say? Probably. You would expect it. And maybe others of you would too. I'll tell you what, the people from arts and sciences in that room nearly fell out of their chairs because they were not expecting it. So why? Why? Well, he wants his welders to get into that churning market, and it is that, with a capacity for active involvement in diverse communities. And is that might, your welders are out there working in a diverse community. They need to know. They need to have some diversity learning. They need some intercultural communication. They're increasingly diverse themselves. Now, why ethics? Why get so exercised about ethics if you're the welding chair? Anybody want to shout that one out? It took me a little while to figure, okay. That's precisely it. How would you like your welder to take a shortcut on a bridge? Okay, so my first LEAP recommendation, use those essential learning outcomes and added to, with systems thinking, reflection, and so forth. I want to give you another example, just so it's not just welding. This one's from fire technology. I was working at Oxnard College in California. It's a community college north of Los Angeles, and I was talking to a woman named Gail Warner, who's director of fire technology, and I blogged about this. So I'm going to quote my blog. After 18 years as a firefighter and 10 years in higher education as a fire science educator, Gail knows what her students need. It's a 21st century liberal education. Firefighters need to be interculturally sensitive and experienced so that they can work under pressure with a broad diversity of people. They need to use advanced technology, including information technology. Their verbal skills, written and oral, need to be honed and ready. They must be team workers. They need to speak a language in addition to English. We're talking about a broad set of skills and abilities way beyond what most people think when they think of firefighters. So Gail repeats something that we hear constantly from employers. Students will learn most of the job-related knowledge and skills they need on the job. It's our responsibility to give them the job basics together with general education, essential learning outcomes that will lead to employment. We need more of general education in CTE, not less. More of what you call liberal education sets you up for the future. It makes you employable. Community college students, career and technical students need and deserve more than job training in order to be successful, she concluded. They need English, natural sciences, social sciences, psychology. They need it all. So on she went. The question is, how do you do this? How do you get some of the characteristics of this engaged liberal learning into the programs that you're thinking about? Well, let's get back to welders. You need to make it possible for welders to study ethics. A whole course? Maybe not. I mean, if you can do it, maybe not. Maybe some online adaptive learning modules with a mentor or a coach. Now that's interesting thinking. If somebody can develop an ethical decision maker app, and it does exist, I kid you not, it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education about 2 weeks ago. If you can make an ethical decision maker app, it is possible to imagine an adaptive learning module. Ethical thinking is critical thinking. You need a good framework of questions to ask. Now, my 16-year-old stepson, who has several learning disabilities, can work with an ethical framework. He needs to be guided and ask the questions. So it's possible to do. It's possible to do in other contexts. Here's the question. If I take a shortcut as a welder, how can I think about the consequences as they will affect other people? Now, for your purposes, and again, I may be speaking to the choir here, and you've already done this, what if you approach the philosophy department or program at your institution and figure out an innovative partnership to do this? Start small, perhaps, but get people together across boundaries, out of their silos, especially crossing between CTE and professional programs and the arts and sciences transfer programs. Figure out how to take a team approach to ethics in all programs. Figure out how to use new technology, the tools to do this. We actually have a rubric on ethical reasoning. And I'm going to be talking in a minute about rubrics. You've got our integrative thinking rubric in your hand. We have one on ethical thinking, so it already exists. It has questions like this. Can the students apply ethical perspectives or concepts to an ethical question, and how well do they do that? Now, you may have heard of Brandman University in California. Their adult and continuing education program is now online, mostly online, and they, in their adult learning program, are using the LEAP outcomes and the rubrics, like ethical reasoning, within an adaptive learning environment. That future is here. They've already got students in that program. This opens up a world in a way that's, I think, really, really important to think about. And I would say the same kind of approach is true of diversity learning. You can build intercultural, interpersonal, intergroup dialogues within the scope of the professional program. And you could do it in collaboration, one of those great learning outcomes you mentioned, if you invite your colleagues in communication studies to get involved, or your colleagues, in fact, in communication studies, people know all about intergroup dialogue and probably would have great ideas. Colleagues in your education programs will be able to guide you, I promise, in creating culturally responsive learning activities. You're going to find those folks in pretty much every education department. Give the welding students a chance to reflect and, on their own capacity, to be actively involved in diverse communities as they address real-world challenges. Give returning adults who enter welding programs the chance to tell their stories of prior learning and provide evidence of proficiency that you can assess. We do actually also have a value rubric on intercultural knowledge and competence, so that is something that you can look at too. So as we continue to think about ways that you can use LEAP, the essential learning outcomes, I'd like you to keep the welders in mind, and I'd also like you, oh, there they are, to think about another profession that is really important and a population I wanted you to hold in mind. Keep the welders in mind. Think about another emerging field for returning adults. So this is a slide, community health workers and health navigators. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this field and about liberal education in this field. My interdisciplinary work, I am an English professor, as I told you, but my interdisciplinary work is in public health. I am a national leader in development of public health programs in undergraduate education. And in the past couple of years, we've had a coalition of public health leaders working with community colleges at the associate level. And so I'm thinking about new associate programs that incorporate public health education, specifically for returning adults. We actually used LEAP for this work. We really did do that, not making that up. And if any of you has a particular question about that, I'd happily elaborate on it later. The League for Innovation in the Community Colleges and the Association of Schools and Programs in Public Health is involved in this work. For now, let me introduce the idea that some of your returning adult students, especially in the critical age group, 25 to 34, are likely to be drawn into these highly useful workforce-ready programs. Community health workers, you may already have a program in that, and those folks in the field often have GEDs or high school diplomas and no college. They are extremely diverse. You want them back. You want them back. And new programs are being created right now in public health for health navigators, a field that is likely to grow. Now, the health navigator curriculum is being designed to produce graduates who are ready for employment as community health workers, patient navigators, or health insurance navigators. And the intent there is to educate health professionals with expertise and experience in assisting individuals and communities to navigate the U.S. community health, healthcare, and health insurance systems, and to actively engage in their own personal prevention and health care. So what you want in these programs is to have graduates who have coursework and experience in all three areas with a culminating experiential curriculum as well as experiential education built throughout the coursework. Chances to hone their written and oral communication skills and their quantitative reasoning, and capacity and ability and practice working in diverse communities. So if you wanted to get more students into welding or into healthcare navigation and you wanted to use liberal education, what are some of the things that you might do? Turn to page 5 of your LEAP introduction. One of the best ways, and I think you've actually already laid this out, to infuse liberal education into programs for returning adults is to use high-impact practices. And we call them HIPs. We've been studying high-impact practices for some years now as a purposeful way to get to engaged learning. And one thing we know about high-impact practices, and you may not know, you'll see a link on the slide, that's important. High-impact experiences, like some of the learning characteristics you identified before, are good for everybody, but if you use them with groups who are underserved, low income, racial ethnic minorities who haven't had a long record of going to college, you use high-impact practices with underserved and underrepresented students, they get a huge boost in learning. It's measurable, we know about it. So actually we have a book, Assessing Underserved Students' Engagement in High-Impact Practices. It's free, it's online, the URL is up there. So what I'd like you to think about is being intentional in using high-impact practices in your work with returning adults, including what they know and do on their return. And I know that a lot of these sound like residential college, but I would argue, and we can talk about this later in Q&A if you want, that pretty much all of these would work for returning adults, but you gotta do some things that are different to make them work. So what you might consider is look at the capstone on page 5, down on the right, the bottom of the right column, it says capstone experiences. You see that? So think about a reflective, project-based or inquiry-based approach, a pedagogy, including maybe a portfolio or an e-portfolio for both learning and assessment as a high-impact practice for returning adults. You can do prior learning assessment that way through high-impact practice. And I want to give you one example. This is a mind lighted on fire, illuminated. This is from a student portfolio from Portland State University. They do lots with e-portfolios. He wanted to show how his mind was set fire by a communication project that he had to do. It's one example. It's kind of a nice one. He had to go out and do some role playing. For my first assignment, I chose my fact sheet from first term. I was required to debate another student posing as Senator Jeff Merkley as incumbent Gordon Smith. This was especially difficult for me because Smith is a conservative Republican and I am generally a moderate Democrat. Because I was forced to make my argument despite my personal beliefs, I feel like I was really stretched to make my arguments believable. This is a communication skill. Absolutely can do this with returning adult. But you've got to have the outcome in communications. You need to have the rubric, an approach to assessment, but you've got all those materials. They're actually sitting in front of you. And what I've been noticing in my work with LEAP around the country is that portfolios are catching fire right now in community colleges in particular, which are the institutions with the fewer dollars per student of any institutions. So if community colleges are making portfolios work, anybody can do it. A couple of them that are doing really well include Wallace State, which I've already mentioned, and Chattanooga State. They're really having a great time with them. Lots of activity, and here is where I want to come back to reflection. You were kind enough to say that reflection really matters as a characteristic of learning. In the context of an e-portfolio, you can do a lot of reflection. And there's a great deal of emerging scholarly work right now, emerging work on transfer of knowledge. I have a fairly superficial understanding of this. But one thing I know, if you want to help people transfer knowledge and skills and dispositions from one situation to another, you need to ask them to reflect on the purpose and value of the learning. Returning adults truly get this and are able to do it. Just ask them and they'll tell you. My recent visits to community colleges have given me a chance to have this conversation with returning adults, a lot of them. I've had some focus groups where you've got returning adults in the room with traditional age students and ask them what they think about critical thinking. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you've ever done it, but amazing thing happens. Reflect on the purpose of your learning, and absolutely you will find the returning adults will tell you as they reflect that they now understand why critical thinking matters. Ask them about poetry. One of the students at Wallace State said this to me: I needed to grow intellectually. I got pushed too fast into a career program that at too high a level. I needed to learn other things first, like loving to read and write. I'm back now in programming, and I'm at a high level. And this is a guy who had been through 5 institutions, I'm not kidding you, was in his late 20s and was back at Wallace finishing up. It wouldn't have worked for me this time, he said, if I hadn't learned to use my mind in ways I never imagined. And so my thought is, if you're going to use reflection through these engaged pedagogies and high-impact practices, inviting returning adults to reflect is one of the smartest things you can do, and there are really beautiful pedagogies that you can use and adapt for that purpose. And the returning adults are going to get it. They're going to eat it up. They truly do understand the power of discovering their own purpose, the joy of reflecting on their learning. They can easily develop a positive mindset about their learning. I mentioned Carol Dweck before, and I think that work is so important. And the other thing I discovered through these conversations is that they are incredible mentors to the younger students on campus. Really, really important that way. So to summarize where we are, concept is to infuse 21st century essential learning outcomes into the returning adult curriculum, and do that wherever possible through high-impact practices, especially by giving the students a chance to collect and document and share evidence of their experience, their prior learning, in an inquiry-based, project-based, reflective activity, but including the big liberal learning outcomes, not just the narrow workforce outcomes. And you might want to consider the value of something called a signature assignment. Salt Lake Community College has really been pioneering on signature assignments, where these are assignments that address specified learning outcomes, and the students craft them any way they want. Now at Salt Lake, they're actually putting them into their e-portfolio. You can actually look at all of this online. When we get to the end, I'm going to give you a URL where you can get to some of the examples. So that's the concept of the outcomes-based curriculum. And I've got about 15 minutes before we start a Q&A to talk about assessment. This is fairly technical, but I want to fast forward through it because I think it's important to you. Assessment. How do you assess some of these activities? LEAP has some help to offer you there, and I'm showing you some of that. Part of what we've done in this campaign for liberal education is to figure out how to assess the learning. And I mentioned the ethical reasoning and the intercultural reasoning. You have in front of you on the big legal page an integrative learning rubric. There are actually 16 of these rubrics. They are free. You can get them at aacu.org. You can download them. You can download them in PDF, or you can download them in Word. And that's good, because then you can customize them for your welding program or for your health navigator program, because they're in Word. They're really pretty amazing. Now, I want to just briefly walk you through the anatomy of the rubric. Oh, and by the way, anybody use the value rubrics? A couple of you know about them, but many of you don't. As I say, there's 16 of them, and they all align with those essential learning outcomes. So it's not just that we're saying, do this for active learning, we're also saying, and here's how you could maybe start to assess it. I liked integrative learning. This is just one of the examples. So you see on the one side, it's got the grid. On the other side, it has some terms. And I bet you've used rubrics before and in your programs. Let me give you just a couple of pointers about this rubric. The left column is the set of criteria for learning in integrative learning. So you've got connections to experience, connections to discipline, transfer, the knowledge transfer, integrated communication, and another reflection and self-assessment. So those are the criteria. The way we designed the value rubrics was pretty amazing. We had a FIPSI grant, we had groups of faculty all over the country designing these rubrics. I got to work on the reading rubric because I'm a reading specialist. So the way they worked is we have 4 different levels of learning for each of the criteria. So the rows are those criteria, and you'll see that it starts with capstone, which is about what we thought college learning should achieve. It doesn't mean senior year, okay? It just means by the time a student finishes college, you hope to get to the capstone level. And you can see as you move to the right, there's a milestone at 3, a milestone at 2, and benchmark learning. Benchmark learning, we hoped, would line up with a Common Core or with the best that students might bring from high school. This is a big dream, to try and make the learning continuous. I know you think about that. But a couple of things to tell you. The benchmark level may or may not be something that a student can achieve when he or she starts. And they may not make it to capstone. There are 16 of these rubrics. You can pick and choose, but what you want to see is a progression of learning so that the student can move from identifying connections between life experience and something academic, like welding, learning to weld and identify something that a person has done earlier to that activity. Maybe it's something to do with teamwork, at the benchmark level, and at the capstone level, synthesizing connections among experiences so that there's a complex kind of growth of learning. I wanted to give you this as an example, And if you would, I think we actually do have time for this, turn to your neighbor and look at this set of learning experiences and performance descriptors across those criteria and see if you think you could adapt them in a program that you care about, or in a welding program, or in a health navigator program. Just take a couple of minutes and talk about how you might start to use these. And then I'll reconvene and we'll go on to the next framework I want to give you. How could you use these in a program that you have right now? I thought the connections to experience was a good one to work on as an example, so you might want to focus on that one, connections to experience. Could you use it? You had no difficulty talking with each other about this. So I think you had some ideas. Is that a correct read? That you figured out some things that you could do with this, maybe making some changes to them, but again, it's easy because they're Word. You just change the language. And I'm happy to argue with all the assessment folks that you can do that and they're still going to give you reliable and valid results. Anybody want to say anything about that? Any insights that you got about taking this kind of approach to a program? But I'm right in reading that you think you could do it. Yes. Okay. Yes. Oh, there's one. Yeah.
I'm at School of Learning at DePaul University, and we're using a similar approach to articulate outcomes or competences for our instructors.
Ah.
So to try to do these types, these levels of so we can do a better job of working on special development.
Absolutely. One of the best things you can do with a value rubric is get your faculty together and sit down and talk. They're amazing occasions for refocusing on learning. You can use them with the students, you can use them with the faculty. There are all kinds of good ways you can use them. But the thing that I love about it is that they're all aligned with the best that we know about a liberal education for everybody. And so you can be confident that you're working with consensus outcomes. And I think that's really important. Well, let me complicate this a little more. I know I said I was going to be packing a lot in. There's this thing called the degree qualifications profile. Do you know about it? Some of you do. Okay. Well, let me tell you a little more about it. This is another framework that connects with LEAP. It was developed in partnership with AAC&U and other organizations with funding from the Lumina Foundation. And the DQP definitely aligns with LEAP. But it does something more. The thing that it does that the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes and the value rubrics don't do is that it attempts to describe the learning in profile. Think just profile, not all the warts and details, but just profile at the degree level. Now, that's different. In your handout, you'll see a multicolored set of pages. These are the learning statements from the DQP. This, again, free, open, online. Anybody can have it. You can modify it. The idea is to try and explain the learning criteria as they are laid out across the associate, the baccalaureate, and the master's degree. And that could be extremely useful to you. So if you look at the page on applied and collaborative learning, which obviously these are going to overlap with the value rubrics really well, but the difference is if you turn to applied and collaborative learning, you're going to see some of the learning statements are red, and some are brown, and some are blue. And they don't all line up. But the hope is that they're showing a progression of learning from the associate's degree through the master's degree. And that is pretty interesting. And if you take one of these learning outcomes and work on it, you can actually map it onto the value rubrics. And some places are doing that. In fact, at Middlesex Community College and University of Massachusetts Lowell, they're doing that in quantitative reasoning. to try and figure out how to help transfer students do better. So at the associate level, in applied and collaborative learning, you would want a student to be able to describe in writing at least one case in which knowledge and skills acquired in academic settings may be applied to a field-based challenge, and evaluates the learning gained from the application using evidence and examples. You want that at the associate degree level, whether it's a transfer degree or not. I think these learning statements could be incredibly useful to you in your returning adult programs, and I'm not sure you've been using them. But I hope you see that they add the other dimension. The Lumina has asked us to work with them and other people. There are 400 colleges and universities testing these statements right now and modifying them, so you may see another version coming along. But again, they're out there for you to use, and if you're building an assessment plan for prior learning, they can be incredibly valuable. The University of Wisconsin system is doing this with their flex degree option. You may have heard of that. That's a returning adult program, largely online, and they're using all these tools for doing that. So I thought you might be interested in that. Now, a final couple of thoughts before we go into Q&A. The value rubrics and the DQP learning statements are rich in the language of proficiency. And that's the key. And what I was hoping to emphasize today, these frameworks use really strong action verbs to talk about what students can do in combined and complex ways. That's different, in my view, from what I often see in competency frameworks. I think there's a difference between proficiency and competency, and it's worth, anyway, having the mind exercise of figuring that out. If the competencies are itemized pieces of a task, the proficiencies are big synthetic abilities to pull together. So to use a piece of welding machinery or equipment, you learn the steps, and you could break it down into competencies. And those are functional. And to understand an insurance form, if you're a health navigator, you need to master some technical vocabulary competencies. And you could do that, and you could say what they are, and you could actually program it and use an adaptive learning environment for that, which is part of what Brandon's doing. But what we're talking about through LEAP is the higher order progression of learning and progressions of learning that are appropriate for college learning, not itemized or atomized, but growing and cumulative. And so I'm suggesting that you think about using LEAP and essential learning outcomes, HIPS, the high impact practices, value in the DQP to assess what they bring and to guide what they do on return, and use the language of proficiency. And if you're really brave, this is really pushing the edge, move away from the credit hour, crack it. Move away from grades, move away from seat time. I think you could do it. I think you could do it with integrity. Our next project is called GEMS, General Education Maps and Markers. We're trying to do that. We're trying to figure it out for Gen Ed. Easy, right? Let me just close by pointing back to employers. There's a reason for doing this. Nearly 2/3 of employers think that today's graduates need both broad learning and in-depth learning. Preparation for a specific job is not enough. We've got some great employer survey materials on our website. The URL is there. They're fabulous. That's what we hear. Employers do want graduates who can deal with ethical questions and intercultural competence. And we know we need those skills for democracy too. So this is the challenge. Can we make liberal learning happen for young adults we've imagined? I think it will take creativity and boldness, and it will also require some boundary pushing if we're really going to assess prior learning in a rich and useful and genuine way. It also takes a deep belief in the students, which I know you have from the things that you've said. They have the talents and the assets, experiences, the hopes, and the passions to learn in the ways we have discussed. And so I say again, I'm suggesting a proficiency-directed framework for learning and assessment designed to reach and meet a set of engaged learning outcomes as the basis for work with returning adults. And I tried to capture on the slide some of the suggestions. On the outcomes and experiences, the flexible modes and methods for learning and assessment, the use of proficiency, the active work all around in learning and assessment, and an emphasis on life purpose and positive mindset for the students seem to me the best ways to be thinking about it. And finally, I'd say let the students guide you. Talk with them. And if you at all possible, talk with them in a mixed group with different ages. Have some grandmothers in there because they're out there. Every time I go to a community college and talk to students, I get a grandmother. As well as the returning adults. Talk with them. Maybe share some of these materials with them. Ask them about their purpose, their social responsibility. Ask them what they value about learning. Think about asking them to demonstrate what they want to do as partners in their own education, as partners. And I want to close by quoting this amazing study that, you know, the Gallup polls. There's a recent study that Gallup did with Purdue University. It was a study on success. And they used huge databases from the Gallup polls to try and figure out why adults could thrive, why they were happy, or happy enough in this human condition we're in. The study found that support and experience in college, support and experience had more of a relationship to long-term outcomes for college graduates than anything else. For example, if graduates recalled having a professor who cared about them as a person, made them excited about learning, encouraged them to pursue their dreams, their odds of being engaged at work, years later, more than doubled. More than doubled. As did their odds of thriving in all aspects of their well-being. And if graduates had an internship or a job in college where they were able to apply what they were learning in the classroom, were actively involved in extracurricular activities and organizations, and worked on projects that took a semester or more to complete, big learning progression, their odds of being engaged at work doubled as well. I love that kind of approach to learning. It's the sort of thing that got me into teaching to begin with. I suspect it's what got you to become an educator to begin with also. Thank you. You have been very attentive, and we have some time for questions and comments. So, yes?
You have the site for the Gallup poll?
I do, and it's a long URL. So, you want to come and get it from me? I should have put it up there. Oh, maybe I did. Let me see. No, I didn't. But what I did do is put my email. Let me check one more. No, I didn't. The toolkit, the campus toolkit, where you can find Salt Lake and the Roadmap Project, Community College Project, with lots of examples, is it there? And if you want the Gallup information, email me. I'll send it to you. It's a very useful study. That was a lot of stuff in an hour. Yes, question.
I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about the difference between competency-based and proficiency-based, because I know I've heard people claim that,
Yeah.
competency can include proficiency.
I know that too. We have been getting some pushback from people in the field about that because we're doing so much now ourselves with these outcomes. And the people who've been working hardest on the DQP decided that they wanted to make a distinction between narrow competencies, which are smaller building blocks leading to something else, and broader proficiencies. But in the field, I think people are using them interchangeably. I just got to the point where I began to understand the difference. Partly it was, I met somebody from Western Governors. I was talking to that person about the WGU competencies. They're hard to find. Oh, are they hard to find? Have you ever tried to find them? They started out with a broader notion of proficiencies that were cumulative and integrative and applied, and they've sort of walked away from that, and they've now gotten to the point where they're breaking down tasks into discrete component units. That made my antennae vibrate. I thought, something's going on here. It's easier to program competencies defined in the way that I just have than to program proficiencies. And I'm fearful that that may be where we're going in some of the online environments, and I'm worried about that because I'm worried about the folks you're worried about. And that's narrow learning, that's not broad. That's a partial answer, but I know this is a hot issue in the field right now. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts? Yes?
I was thinking about our K-12 partnerships. A lot of us are serving on advisory committees within our communities to help actually connect K-12 to higher education. What is the AAC and you doing in terms of working and connecting with K-12?
Oh, we want to do it so badly. We are having trouble finding a funder who's willing to take that on. They usually say, oh my God, and walk away. David Connolly and Paul Gaston actually wrote a working paper on why it's tough to connect K-12 and higher ed. And they put it's on the Lumina DQP site, so you can see some of the structural issues. I was a school teacher for a lot of years, so I know that and I've worked with some of the frameworks that the Common Core is using. We think you can align the LEAP materials and the Common Core. And we've been trying to find partnership sites where people will do that, and we know where some of them exist. I mentioned UMass Lowell and Middlesex Community College. They're now working with their local schools, using all the materials I just shared with you. We know people in Oregon are doing that. We know they're doing that in Rhode Island. I'm sure I hear in Florida there's some of this work going on.
We have a board foundation in Northwest Florida that's worked with several of our communities and doing this, but it's not all tied together.
That's the thing. Tying it together is the challenge. But I think if the higher ed partners come in with these materials and say, it can work, they're going to be amazed. I mean, we did have a community forum in Virginia, a P16 forum, and brought all this. It was a few years ago, so we didn't really have as robust a set of materials then, but it worked for people. The challenge is the professional development and getting robust communities of educators, especially between grades 12 and 13, but I do believe it can be done, and we hope that's where we're going. Yes. Anybody else? A question, a challenge? Yes.
You left us with a tremendous challenge, which is to move away from the credit hour, seat time, grade.
I know.
And I'm going to date myself because I've worked in programs for the last many, many years that have done that. And the pressures to stop doing that and get back in the mainstream are enormous. So I'm wondering what you see as the promise now that would make a return to these
Okay.
things more possible.
That's a great question. First thing, we've got technology we didn't have before. That's important. It's not about the technology is a tool, but we can make connected learning happen in ways we could not before. But the other thing that's a big difference, I would say, is that there is more receptivity in higher education for using genuine assessment of learning outcomes. We have noticed it as a sea change at AAC&U. And I know we speak to the choir, I get that. But still, we do a lot of surveys of our member institutions, 1,330 college and university members, and they're into assessment in different ways. They want it to be genuine, they want it to be different from grading, and they want it to flow into an information system that actually offers a complex student record, not just those Carnegie unit things. But all of that is possible now. We have learning analytics we didn't have before. And we've been amazed. Every software provider that's working with rubrics has taken those free value rubrics and programmed them in. They all of them have them. So you can just start using them. You don't even have to put them into the assessment system. Those are differences. You can go on and talk about the changing academic workforce. It's having a huge effect. And that's a worry. The majority of folks are working on contingent contracts. Are we helping faculty on term contracts to use these tools? They are being told to use them. Can they use them well in a learning environment, get the support to use them well in a learning environment that moves away from the credit hour? There are some interesting experiments. One of them is being conducted by the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, WITCHE. It's called the Interstate Passport. And they're experimenting with a proficiency-based transfer package that can cross state lines. Now they haven't abandoned the credit hour in grades. They're using a translation mode. They're trying to do both. And I think that's going to be something that we will see. Yeah. But I think that's a very important question. And I hope you hear me when I say I value the deep learning. We don't want to lose that. We don't want to narrow. We really want to open up learning if we're going to make that transition, and how to do it well, and how to do it well in a way that will empower the majority of students. Yeah.
Let me just add, like the Adult Learning Consortium, these are absolutely essential movements to have, because the whole history has been one institution, one program at a time, little silos, and so I think that's a huge...
It's a huge change. I agree with you. I agree with you, and that's why I stay with it. It's a hard thing to move this enterprise. And those of us who've been at it for years are realistic. But I believe we should hope and keep collaborating. Reflecting and collaborating and using system thinking. All the things you said that you added. Very, very important. Thank you. I believe we are out of time. I've enjoyed talking with you. Reach me, if you like, by email. And I hope I gave you some few new things to think about.